Alright, I've gone over the fuselage here and looked for places to put this anti-chafe tape, and the place that I got it for was here. This is where the tail strakes for the STOL system, the wing vortex generators, goes, and that was a sore spot on there before, and they'd had it built up with masking tape, and it absorbed all kinds of moisture and rusted and was pretty nasty. And this, I cleaned it up, but this still sticks out, especially here where these worm gear hose clamps are with the worm drive on them. They stick out. They would have braided through the fabric. So that's what I got it for, is just those. I've got it on both of these. The plans up there, or the drawing up there that I've got, says to put a piece of masking tape here over this fairing that goes up on the vertical fin. Well, I would put masking tape on there, but I put some of this anti-chafe tape on there, so that should work. I put some on these little brackets that I made for these tail strakes, and I probably didn't really need them there because I have these rounded over pretty good, and so the fabric, there's no rough edges on that, but I put them on there anyway. And then I had a couple places here where the nut plates can stick out, maybe screws stick out. It might possibly rub on there a little bit. It shouldn't, but just in case, I put a little bit of that tape on there. And then, here's a little rough spot right here where this stringer runs into this. Same on the other side. Oh, that about does it. Anyway, I got anti-chafing tape on there. Well, I've got lots of it left over. You'd hardly ever know I used any of it. Oh, I can do 100 airplanes like that. This stuff is kind of like duct tape without all the ducts. It's a cloth woven tape with adhesive on it. It's kind of like the old-fashioned adhesive tape you used to use to put bandages on and stuff like that, but there's not a whole lot of adhesive on it. And it's stringy, and strings all come off of it and stuff. So anyway, I got lots of that left too. Got the fabric envelope draped over the airframe. Got it pinned on up there on that rear stringer, on the top stringer, with some spring clamps. Not quite sure exactly how to go about doing this now. Watched a couple videos of guys doing it. They clamped it like that on the back and then pulled it down tight around the lower longerons and glued it on, and then went around every place else. But I'm kind of thinking I don't want to do that, because by the time you pull it tight and glue it on down there, then you either pop those spring clamps off, or the spring clamps are on tight, then it leaves a lot of slack up there on the top. Plus, it's a chance of pulling that seam off a line. I want to keep that seam right on that line on that stringer there, that top stringer. I don't want it pulling off one side or the other. What I'm thinking about doing is taking some poly-tack and just tacking down my seam to that top stringer in a few places instead of using those clamps. Then I can pull the fabric around and use the clamps down on the, well, I can't use them on the lower stringer because I've got the fabric on there already. But anyway, I'll have something tight to pull against, and I won't have to worry about popping those spring clamps off, and I won't have to worry about getting that seam off the center. And if there's a problem, I can always just rub a little MEK on the seam on the poly-tack and loosen it up. Well, I think that's what I'm going to do. The polyfiber says you don't glue to one of those stringers up there. You only glue down to structural members, and that top stringer is not a structural member. On the original Cub, the stringers were wooden. Then on the later ones, like the other fuselage, the stringers are aluminum. This one, when I had it built, they welded in steel tubing there for the stringers instead of aluminum, and so they're stronger. They're not going to move so much. That whole top section of the airframe, from where the yellow is, from where the baggage compartment is, back above that upper longeron, is non-structural. It's just there to fair the airplane out. But on the original drawings that I have of the Cub, they were doing that with cotton, and they were gluing it down to that top stringer. I don't see any reason not to glue it down to that top stringer. It's not a structural seam. The seam in there is sewn, so that makes it doesn't need to be glued down, that seam. So anyway, if I glue it down there, I think that's the way to do it. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go ahead and tack that down with poly tack around on that seam to keep it lined up and everything, and then we'll figure out the rest of it from there. Well, it took some doing, but I finally got that cover tacked on, pretty much glued onto that stringer. I had a heck of a time. I started back here on the tail, and I just couldn't get it to stick at all. There's not much surface to stick on. I just wanted to stick right on the kind of the point of the curve of that tubing that runs down through there for that stringer, and the same thing going up the vertical fin, but I just couldn't get it to stick. I took it all off there and put it on the bench, the fabric inside out kind of, I guess, and not that it makes any difference which side is which. It's a French fell seam, and it's same on both sides. It's kind of like the seam on a pair of jeans, on the inside of a pair of jeans. I put that on the bench, then I took the MEK and scrubbed the seam down real good with MEK and a clean rag. And then I thinned some poly tack down real thin and spread on the seam to try to get some penetration. I think that's what was going on, is the poly tack just wasn't penetrating the fabric at all, because there's, I don't know what it is, there are 3 or 4 layers of fabric right there in that seam. 4 layers, I guess. It wasn't penetrating enough to stick to it. So that's what I did. I saturated that seam with some real thin poly tack, and then I went down the leading edge of that vertical fin and that stringer with some more real thin poly tack, and then I came back and started gluing it on there. I would glue a little bit at a time, about 8 inches, 6 to 8 inches at a time, and I put a little bit of glue on the leading edge of, well, again, it started out on the fin, but started out about 8 inches, and just a little bit, well, as much as I could get stick on there, some thickened up poly tack. Now, it was not thick out of the can, it's still thinned with MEK, but it's not as thin as the stuff that I use on the fabric. I put that on there and then rubbed it in with my fingers, and then I kept a brush in some MEK, and I would run that down and kind of soak that real good on the seam, on the outside edge of the seam, and rub that in so that it softened up the poly tack that was on the tubing and in the seam itself, to try to get them to blend together. And that seemed to work. I'd have to hold the seams a while and rub them with my fingers real good to get that MEK worked in there. But that did 2 things. It helped bond that poly tack in and get it in through the weave of the fabric and get it to bond. But it also helped me smooth out the fabric in that seam from being wadded up in that box for so long after we stitched it all together and rolled up and stuff in a ball. It got some pretty good wrinkles and stuff in that seam. Rubbing it with the fingers with the seam saturated with the MEK and with the poly tack coming through it, that smoothed out those wrinkles pretty good in most of it. There's still some in there. They'll come out with the iron. But anyway, took me a while to get all that done, a little bit at a time, the full length of that, and I've got it stuck up there now. So, and it's 1:30 in the morning. Well, I think that's about all I'm going to do. I'm going to roll that fuselage back up straight and clip that fabric up there so it's all clipped up, and then figure out what to do with it tomorrow. I'm not sure exactly what to do next. I'm thinking maybe doing that vertical fin, at least the top seam on the vertical fin, and then we'll see where we go from there.